Some corpses speak in silence, but this one whispered in horror, without a single drop of blood left behind. Holmes stared at the pale, hollow body on the floor and muttered, "This man didn't die, he was emptied. Welcome to the detective files, where logic meets mystery. And no case stays closed for long." It was 9:30 when Mrs. Hudson knocked on our sitting room door, not with her usual politeness, but with a sense of urgency that made Holmes raise his eyes mid-pipe. "Detective Inspector Lestrade is here," she said breathlessly, "and he insists it cannot wait." Holmes rose at once, slipping into his coat without a word. The winter fog pressed itself against the windows like a woolen curtain soaked in ice. Even the fire in our hearth seemed reluctant to burn. Within moments Lestrade entered, his moustache bristling with frost, and a tremble in his gloved hands he didn't bother to hide. "We've a situation in Maida Vale," he said, "a man dead in his home. Locked room, windows sealed, no signs of a struggle." Holmes's brows arched with mild disappointment. "And you braved the chill for a locked room mystery, Lestrade? I expected at least an escaped tiger, or a vanishing cathedral." Quote. Lestrade looked me square in the face instead. "There's not a drop of blood in the man's body, Dr. Watson, not one. And the coroner swears there are no puncture wounds." I blinked. "No blood loss, yet no blood inside him." Lestrade nodded grimly. "He's pale as parchment, but the body is clean." Too clean. Holmes stood up slowly, the sparkle of challenge now dancing in his eyes. "Watson," he said, already moving toward the door, "bring your bag. We are either about to meet a most cunning murderer, or a medical impossibility." I grabbed my coat and followed them both into the thick yellow fog. The streets of London were quieter than usual, as if the city itself had overheard Lestrade's words and decided to hold its breath. As we neared Maida Vale, the lamps grew dimmer, and a foul, sour scent clung to the air. I glanced at Holmes. He had already noticed. The townhouse at number 17 Wilcombe Lane stood in complete silence. No constables, no neighbors peering out, no footsteps, save for ours pressing against damp stone. Lestrade unlocked the front door with a brass key, and it creaked open as if the house itself exhaled. A stale, metallic scent hit my nose immediately. Not quite blood, but something close, like old iron soaked in damp cloth. Holmes crossed the threshold, eyes darting like a bird's, taking in every object, every smell, every subtle imbalance. The drawing room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp left burning on a mantel, crowded with porcelain figurines. An untouched tea tray sat nearby with 2 cups, one of them shattered, as if dropped in haste. Then I saw him. The body lay slumped on a high-backed chair, facing the fireless hearth. He was an older man, perhaps in his 60s, still dressed in an elegant housecoat of deep maroon velvet. His face was ghastly pale, almost bluish-white, and his mouth was slightly open, as if trying to form one final word. I stepped closer. "No blood on the clothing," I murmured. "No visible wound. Skin is cold, but not frozen." Holmes didn't respond. He circled the body slowly, eyes narrowed, hands clasped behind his back. Then, quite suddenly, he knelt and pressed his fingers to the dead man's temple. "Watson," he said softly, "feel his neck." Just below the jawline, I did as asked. The skin was paper-thin, and beneath it, no pulse, no tension, no sign of trauma. "There's no bruising, no puncture, nothing." Holmes nodded. "Now, open his left eye." I hesitated, then carefully lifted the eyelid. The eyeball had collapsed. Slightly. It wasn't dehydration. It was pressure loss. "His vitreous humor is compromised," I said quietly, "but that would suggest internal collapse." Holmes stood and walked to the window. He drew back the curtain an inch and peered into the fog. No signs of forced entry. No footprints in the garden. No broken glass. Yet something, or someone, removed nearly all fluids from this man's body. Lestrade cleared his throat uneasily. "There's a rumor floating about," he said. "Locals say it's the work of something not quite human. A drinker of essence, they called it." Holmes turned sharply. "Ghosts do not use teacups, Lestrade." He walked back toward the tea tray and picked up the intact cup. He sniffed it, then dipped a gloved finger inside and touched it to his tongue. He froze. Then his eyes narrowed. "Watson," he murmured, "how long does it take for chloral hydrate to lose its bitterness? Once mixed with warm tea, I blinked. 10, maybe 15 minutes. Why Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the body and whispered, "This man didn't die alone." Holmes stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the untouched teacup. Then, slowly, he straightened his back and turned toward Lestrade. "You said the room was locked from the inside." Lestrade nodded. "Yes, door was bolted. No sign of forced entry. Window latch secured. Our men had to force the door open this morning after the housemaid raised alarm. She hadn't seen the master since last evening." Holmes walked to the door, examined the bolt mechanism, then crossed over to the windows and inspected the inner frame. "There are no signs of tampering," he murmured. "No disturbed dust. No scratches on the wood. Whoever was here didn't leave through conventional means." I watched him closely. There was a tension in his movements. Not panic, but a kind of alertness I'd seen only a handful of times before. The kind of alertness he wore when facts tried to lie. "Did the housemaid hear anything during the night?" Holmes asked. Lestrade shook his head. "She sleeps in the attic. Claims she heard a soft sound downstairs around midnight, like the strike of a poker, or maybe dropped silverware. But she was too afraid to come down alone." Holmes's gaze shifted. "Where is she now?" "In the kitchen. We've kept her in the back." "She's shaken. I'll speak with her shortly," Holmes said. "But first." He walked back to the tea tray, lifted the untouched cup again and held it to the light. Then he did something strange. He tipped it slowly toward the broken cup lying on the carpet. A faint line of residue ran along the bottom. "Like milk long dried, but with a silvery hue, Watson," he said. "Bring me your magnifier." I handed it over. Holmes crouched, examined the contents of the intact cup, then looked at the rim of the shattered one. His jaw tightened. "There were 2 people drinking," he said, "but only one cup was laced with chloral hydrate. The guests, not the victims." Lestrade blinked. "Then who was drugged?" Holmes stood and faced the room. His voice lowered. "No one was drugged. The guest brought the chloral hydrate to use on the host. But either the victim refused the drink, or he realized it too late." He paused. "There was a plan here. Something went wrong. The poison remained unused, yet the victim is still dead, in a state that medicine can't explain. My skin crawled. A house sealed tight. A guest who never drank. A host drained of life, yet untouched." Holmes suddenly walked to the bookcase on the far wall. Dozens of antique volumes lined the shelves. Poetry, astronomy, ancient medicine. He ran his finger across the spines until he stopped at a large, leather-bound journal with no title. He pulled it out. Its pages were handwritten, crowded with anatomical sketches, symbols, and marginal notes in Latin. Holmes turned to me slowly. "I believe," he said quietly, "we may not be looking at a killer, but at someone who was experimenting." The kitchen was quiet. Too quiet for a home that had once breathed the rituals of evening tea and poetry readings. Mrs. Liddell, the housemaid, sat at the edge of a wooden stool, hands folded tight in her lap, as if trying to press her fingers into invisibility. She was in her early 40s, bonnet slightly askew, face pale with lack of sleep. Her eyes darted to Holmes, then back to the cracked tiles beneath her feet. "I didn't hear much," she whispered. "Just the sound of a glass tapping, not breaking, like something being stirred with a spoon. Then, maybe 15 minutes later, a soft thud, like a chair being moved, or someone falling very gently." "And you didn't come down?" I asked gently. She shook her head. "I never go downstairs after 10, sir. Master always made that clear. Said he worked late, studied strange things, told me to keep to my floor." Holmes was standing by the kitchen sink, examining a thin trail of white powder near the edge of the counter. He sniffed it, frowned, then said, "You mentioned he studied strange things. Do you know what kind?" Mrs. Liddell hesitated. Her lips trembled. "He received parcels from the continent. Germany, mostly. Sometimes wrapped in thick wax paper. Sometimes books with locks. I never opened them, but once I saw a diagram in his study." She glanced toward the door, then leaned closer to me. "It was of a heart, sir. Not just the organ, but symbols around it, like a map, but written in symbols instead of words." He told me it was from a monastery in Prague. Holmes turned sharply. "A map of the circulatory system layered with symbols?" Esoteric symbols, she nodded quickly. He called it. The vessel within the vessel said every human body has a shadow version of itself, made not of flesh but of essence. The word hung in the air like mist. Holmes looked thoughtful, not alarmed, but intrigued. Lestrade scoffed from the doorway. Next you'll tell me he bottled souls in his cellar. Holmes didn't even glance at him, Mrs. Liddell, he said. Did he have any visitors yesterday? One, sir. A young gentleman. Clean coat, expensive hat. Arrived around 6 in the evening. I answered the door myself. The master seemed surprised to see him, but he let him in. Did the visitor give a name? She shook her head. No, sir. But his accent was northern, Yorkshire or thereabouts. And, she swallowed, he had strange eyes. One brown, one almost silver. Gave me a chill, that one. Holmes turned toward Lestrade. Put out word for a man of that description. High-end tailor shops, book dealers, and telegram offices. Anyone who handled European imports. Lestrade scribbled furiously. What's the play here, Holmes? Holmes picked up a cracked porcelain plate from the sink and examined it as though it were a page of scripture. We are not merely investigating a murder, he said calmly. We are unraveling the intentions of a man who may have believed he could touch the human soul, and someone else who came to steal it. Holmes didn't speak for several seconds. His gaze was fixed on the cellar door, barely ajar, just enough to betray a recent presence. He moved toward it without a word, the wooden floor beneath him creaking softly in the kitchen's oppressive silence. Lestrade straightened, but didn't follow. Watson and I exchanged glances. Then I rose and fell in behind Holmes. The door groaned as he pushed it open fully. A narrow flight of stone steps descended into complete blackness. No lanterns, no sounds. Just cold air rising like breath from the depths of something forgotten. Holmes withdrew a matchstick, lit it, then pulled a small pocket lantern from his coat. Its soft glow cast long shadows on the stone walls as we began to descend. The smell changed first. It was not decay, but something chemical, acrid, metallic, the sort of scent that lived in old laboratories and abandoned apothecaries. The cellar opened into a vaulted chamber beneath the house, larger than I expected. The brick walls were lined with wooden shelves, most covered in dust, but some carefully cleared. Bottles, scrolls, preserved specimens floated in murky fluids, and a central work table stood under a web-choked iron chandelier. But what caught my eye was the mirror. 6 feet tall, framed in black oak, it leaned against the far wall like it had been hidden in haste. But it wasn't the mirror's presence that unnerved me. It was its reflection. It showed the room, yes, but not quite right. The chandelier's reflection flickered, though the real one did not. Holmes's lantern appeared dimmer in the mirror. And strangest of all, the mirror showed a figure standing beside the table. But no one was there. Holmes noticed it too. He approached slowly, lantern raised, but did not touch the glass. His voice was measured when he spoke. This is no ordinary mirror. It's lead-backed. Early 18th century. Possibly Venetian. He stepped to the side and gestured for me to look. In the reflection I could see myself. Holmes. The cellar. The table. The bottles. And still, the shadow of a man remained in the same spot, unmoving. Tall. Thin. Head bowed slightly. I turned quickly. Nothing behind me. Lestrade, who had finally followed us down, let out a nervous breath. Some kind of illusion. Holmes didn't blink. Possibly. Or perhaps, a tool for someone who believed they could reach a reflection of the soul. He turned away from the mirror and moved to the work table. Papers were scattered in a neat yet frantic fashion. Sketches of human hearts, alchemical formulas, a Latin phrase repeated several times. Corpus sine sanguine, anima sine lumine, I translated aloud. A body without blood, a soul without light. Holmes nodded. This man wasn't just studying anatomy. He was attempting a separation, a split between the physical body and something else. He picked up a vial from the table, half filled with a silver liquid, thick and pulsing slightly. Not alive, but not quite still either. We stared at it. None of us spoke. Holmes set the vial down slowly. Its silver contents pulsed once more, then settled, as if sensing it had been seen. I stepped closer to the work table. That's no ordinary compound, I said softly. The viscosity is all wrong. It's thicker than mercury, but lighter than oil. Holmes said nothing. He was still staring at the mirror. It showed a man, he murmured. And it did so, without reflection. What does that tell you, Watson? That we've either stumbled into madness, I said grimly, or into something staged so precisely that it plays with our sanity. Lestrade, behind us, let out a stiff chuckle. If this is theatre, it's the most expensive production I've ever walked into. Holmes didn't laugh. Instead, he walked back to the mirror. Slower this time. He stopped just inches away, studying his own reflection, and the shadow that wasn't his. He raised his lantern higher. The glass caught the light differently now. Not as a flat plane, but as if the mirror had depth, like peering into shallow water at dusk. Then it happened. Just for a second. The shadow turned its head inside the glass. Not Holmes. Not me. Not Lestrade. Just the figure. I gasped. So did Lestrade. Holmes didn't move, but his knuckles whitened around the lantern. Then, in a calm and quiet voice, he said, "It blinked." We all stared at the mirror, but the figure was now gone. The reflection was ordinary again. The chandelier. The work table. Us. Nothing else. Holmes finally stepped back. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw it, a flicker of something rare, doubt. Not of the mind, but of reason itself, gentlemen, he said, voice tight. We are dealing with something that cannot be measured in feet or hours. This house, this room, may contain more than one version of time. Lestrade cleared his throat. You mean, like a haunting? Holmes gave him a look so sharp, it cut through the fog in the room. No. I mean, a resonance. A chemical mirror. A distortion of matter tied to memory. The man who lived here was not merely a student of anatomy. He was mapping the border between life and whatever comes after it. I took a breath. You think this experiment, whatever it was, succeeded? Holmes turned to the table, lifted a folded paper from beneath the vial, and handed it to me. I opened it. The ink was hurried but legible, a single sentence, circled thrice in red. I have found the channel, but something has found me back. We stood in silence, the echo of that final sentence still hanging in the cellar air. Holmes closed the paper and tucked it into his coat. His expression had shifted, no longer driven by curiosity, but by a quiet, pressing urgency. We must find the origin point, he said. Whatever occurred here, it began from something fixed. A circle. A symbol. A trigger. He began to move slowly around the room, his lantern casting sweeping arcs of gold across brick, metal, and shadow. He tapped gently on floorboards, listening to the tone beneath his boots. Then, just left of the work table, he stopped. He bent low, brushed aside a dusty rug, and revealed a patch of stone flooring. At its center was a circle, not painted, but engraved into the stone itself, about 3 feet across. Weathered. Ancient. At first glance it resembled an old guild emblem. But as Holmes cleared more dust from the grooves, I saw the details. It wasn't a sigil of trade or family. It was anatomical. A heart, an eye, a spiral, and 12 curved symbols surrounding it. Unfamiliar to me, but precise. As if drawn not for beauty, but for function. Holmes knelt beside it, running one gloved finger over the grooves. Watson, he said without looking up. This predates the house I blinked predates? Holmes, this neighborhood is barely a century old. Exactly, he whispered. But this mark is far older. This house was built atop it. Deliberately, Lestrade stepped forward, visibly unsettled. You're saying this man bought a property specifically because it was built over a symbol buried in the floor? Holmes finally looked up. Not bought, inherited. Passed through bloodlines. Which means... He paused, then rose quickly. Which means we must speak to the maid again. We made our way up from the cellar. My legs felt heavier than before, as though gravity had increased down there, clinging to our shoes. In the drawing room, Mrs. Liddell waited, fidgeting with the corner of her apron. Holmes didn't waste time, Mrs. Liddell, who owned this house before your employer. She blinked his father, sir, and before him, I believe his uncle. They were private men. Scholars, mostly. The master used to say he came from a line of quiet cartographers. I thought he meant map-makers. Holmes tilted his head. Cartographers of what? The maid shrugged faintly. Of the unseen, I suppose. He said their maps were never drawn on paper. Quote, "We stood frozen." Lestrade scratched his temple. I swallowed hard. Holmes, voice low, asked his final question. "And when was the first time you saw that mirror?" The maid hesitated. "The day his uncle died." Holmes stood very still in the center of the drawing room, not pacing, not deducing aloud, just still. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from thought, but from recognition. "This house is not a laboratory," he said at last. "It's a vault." Watson and I waited, a vault for knowledge passed down like heirlooms, not written, not spoken, only practiced. He turned toward the fireplace and stared at the empty hearth. They were not just physicians, these men. They were architects of internal maps, not of organs, but of passageways, places where the boundary between physical and conceptual weakens. Lestrade finally broke the silence and the corpse upstairs. "What do you make of that now?" Holmes responded without turning. "I believe he reached something, or opened something, and in return something was taken." I stepped forward. "His blood." "Possibly," Holmes said, "or perhaps what the blood represents." Watson frowned. "Life." Holmes nodded slowly. "Or essence. The Latin phrase said it. A body without blood is not just empty, it is unanchored." He turned to us then, his face unreadable. But there was something behind his eyes. Not fear, not belief. Something heavier, personal. He pulled the folded paper from his pocket, the one we found in the cellar, and handed it to me again. Beneath the original sentence, now visible in the light of the drawing room, was a second line written in smaller ink. "They found me because I carry the mark. It passes down the line," Watson whispered. "You think this was a family curse?" "No," Holmes said, "not a curse. A key." He looked around the room once more, and keys open doors. Lestrade cleared his throat. "Holmes, are you suggesting this family has been conducting generational rituals?" "Experiments," Holmes nodded. "Yes. And not all of them successful. This death, it was either the final attempt or the first that succeeded." I folded the note carefully. My hands were colder than they had been in the cellar. Holmes turned to the mirror one last time. It was still. Empty. "Whatever he let in," Holmes said, "it didn't leave through the door." The morning light had begun to bleed faintly through the fog outside, but inside the house, time felt stagnant, as if no hour dared move forward without permission from the dead. Holmes stood motionless at the drawing room window, his breath fogging the glass. "Watson," he said quietly, "have you ever wondered what it means to inherit more than just name and blood?" I turned to him. "Do you mean trauma?" He nodded. "Or obsession? Or purpose? What if every man in this family was not just driven by curiosity, but bound to it?" He moved back toward the fireplace and opened the drawer built into the side of the mantel. Inside were dozens of envelopes, all sealed, all unaddressed. He pulled one at random, broke the wax and removed a folded note. The handwriting was the same as the parchment from the cellar. It read, "If the mirror shows movement, do not speak. If the vial pulses, do not breathe. If you feel your own heartbeat stop, finish the ritual." Watson swallowed. This was no experiment. It was doctrine. Holmes set the note aside. Then opened another. "They say the first to see it is the last to forget. I have not slept in 17 days. We opened 3 more, each one darker than the last. One included a detailed drawing of a human brain, with ink-drawn lines running out like roots, connecting to strange icons and stars. Another included a pressed petal, blackened and dry, labeled, "Taken from the mouth of a waking corpse." The final envelope was thicker. It held a strip of skin, real skin, tattooed, with a symbol identical to the engraving we saw beneath the cellar rug. Watson's face went pale. Lestrade stepped back. Holmes did not flinch. Instead, he took the strip gently in both hands and held it to the light. "It's not preserved," he said calmly. "This was taken recently." "Meaning?" I asked. "Meaning," Holmes replied. "Someone has continued the work, and they are still near." At that moment, the mirror, still and silent for hours, cracked. A single fracture, vertical, thin as a hair, but loud enough to feel. The crack in the mirror deepened, not with the shatter of glass, but with the slowness of intention. Holmes rose slowly, his eyes fixed on the fracture. He took no notes, asked no questions, just watched. We all did. The mirror, once reflective, now seemed darker than the room it occupied. It no longer showed us, it showed nothing. No furniture, no chandelier, no lantern light, just an empty blackness, and the slow widening of the crack, like a wound opening. Lestrade whispered, "Holmes, should we destroy it?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he stepped forward. Close, too close. I reached out instinctively. Holmes. He raised one hand without turning, not to stop me, but as if sensing movement through the mirror. And then, just faintly, we heard it. Not a sound from the glass. A whisper. From behind us. We turned. No one there. Then again. Another whisper. Closer. But indistinct. Like a name without language. A breath without lungs. Holmes finally spoke. "It's responding to what I asked." He looked over his shoulder at me, and for the first time, I saw his hand tremble to lineage. He reached into his coat and retrieved the strip of tattooed skin. Holding it near the glass, he watched as the mirror, impossibly, reflected it before he raised it. The motion played before it happened. Like memory, being read from the other side. Then the crack pulsed, and for one blinding second, the entire room shifted. Not the walls, not the furniture, but the atmosphere. The heat vanished. The air grew sharp, metallic and pressurized. Like being pulled underwater, I stumbled back, gasping. Lestrade dropped his notebook. The flame in Holmes's lantern shrank to a pinprick, and from the mirror's dark center, a light began to glow. Not bright, not warm, but cold. A light that did not illuminate. It only revealed. And what it revealed was eyes. Thousands. Layered. Rotating. Staring from within the depths, like stars drawn onto glass, all converging inward toward a central void. Then, a single knock echoed through the floorboards. Once. Twice. Then silence. Holmes finally backed away. "It sees us now," he whispered. None of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because language had stepped aside. The air in the drawing room was too thick to breathe, too charged to escape. The mirror stood like a gate half open, still pulsing faintly with inner light. Holmes turned to me. His eyes were not afraid, but they had changed. Softer. "As if something had settled behind them, Watson," he said quietly. "If it speaks again, do not answer," I swallowed. "And if it moves, then we leave this house and seal the door behind us." Lestrade moved toward the window, pulling aside the curtain for a sliver of air, of reason. "This is madness," he muttered. This is theater in hell." Holmes didn't respond. He was now staring at the base of the mirror. "The frame is warped," he said. "It's not decorative, it's structured. A geometry designed to bind." He knelt and traced one finger across the wooden carvings, now glowing faintly in reaction to his touch. Watson stepped forward, hesitantly. "Are you activating it?" "No," Holmes replied. "It was never dormant." The mirror trembled. A second hairline crack bloomed across the surface, intersecting the first. And then, from deep within, a voice. Not a sound, not vibration, but a thought, shared directly. Something ancient, curious, and hungry. Holmes closed his eyes, listened, then whispered, almost to himself, "You know my name." The room dimmed, the chandelier flickered. Then the voice came again, louder this time, but not from the mirror, from inside us. "You carry the mark, through blood, through time. You are the door." Watson grabbed my sleeve. "Holmes, stop." Holmes remained still, but his hand had moved to the center of his chest. "The engraving in the cellar," he said, the spiral. It wasn't symbolic. He unbuttoned the top of his shirt. And there, faint but real, beneath the skin of his breastbone, was the same spiral symbol, dark as ash. Watson stepped back in horror. "You." "Holmes, How Holmes's voice shook. "I've never seen it before." Lestrade turned pale. The mirror's light flared, once, like a flash of silver lightning across glass. And then, silence. The room dimmed again. The cracks in the mirror faded. The light vanished. It was still. Holmes buttoned his shirt, slowly, deliberately, then looked at both of us with the saddest eyes I've ever seen. "It didn't want the victim," he said. "It was only waiting for me." We sealed the room. Not with boards or nails, but with silence. Holmes stood at the doorway, staring one last time at the mirror. It no longer glowed. No more cracks. It had returned to what it had always pretended to be. A reflection of the world. Except it wasn't. It never was. Downstairs, Mrs. Liddell waited with our coats. Her hands trembled as she handed Holmes his scarf. She said nothing. Neither did we. Outside, the fog had lifted. Sunlight spilled onto the wet cobblestones like the memory of something warmer than this house had ever known. We walked 3 blocks before anyone spoke. "Will you keep it?" I asked. Holmes didn't look at me. The scar, I nodded. He gave a small, humorless smile. I don't think I was given a choice. Lestrade shook his head. "I'll file the report as heart failure." No mention of symbols. No mention of mirrors. Holmes nodded wise. Scotland Yard isn't built for doors that open both ways. We said goodbye at the corner of Armsworth Street. Lestrade turned left. Holmes and I continued right. By the time we reached Baker Street, the sun was higher, and London had returned to its morning noise. Carts, boots, whistles. Normality performed its pantomime. But inside 221B, Holmes was quiet. He removed his coat, sat in his chair and lit his pipe. Then stared at the wall for a very long time. I poured tea, let it sit untouched. Then, just before noon, he said it. Not loudly, not even to me, but to something else, something still listening. "I have no interest in being your door." No response. But when I looked at him, his hand was over his chest again, where the mark lay. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to subscribe. More chilling cases, more brilliant deductions, only on The Detective Files.